Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. They say silence isn't always peaceful. In this case, it was a signal, a warning, one no one saw coming until it was too late. At 9:42 p.m., on a winter night in Clarksville, Tennessee, a man stood outside a modest two-bedroom home. The porch light was still on. A black Honda CR-V sat parked in the driveway, exactly where it had been that morning. The man knocked. No response. He texted. Still nothing. He'd known Southan in for years. Army buddies. Quiet, dependable type. Didn't miss calls. Didn't go dark. Especially not with kids at home. Something wasn't adding up. The friend circled around the house, peering into the window. The curtains were drawn. That's when he dialed 911. When officers arrived just after 10 p.m., the house was quiet. No barking dogs, no shouting, no signs of movement. The front door was locked. Through the side window, they noticed a glow from the hallway. And something else. A toddler, barefoot, standing alone in the dim light. Police made entry. The first officer through the door radioed for backup almost immediately. In the master bedroom, lying flat on his back, was 38-year-old Southan In, deceased. Gunshot wound to the forehead. 1 round, clean entry, no signs of a struggle. His body had gone cold. Nearby, 2 young children stood silent near the foot of the bed. In the next room, curled on the floor under a blanket, their mother, Thierry Lim. None of them had called for help. Inside the house, there were no overturned chairs, no broken dishes, no shattered glass, no signs of forced entry. The kitchen sink had 2 unwashed bottles. Toys were scattered near the hallway. The thermostat was set to 71 degrees. To responding officers, it didn't feel like a violent home, not at first, but something else was off. Something colder than death. A sense that this wasn't panic or grief, it was stillness, intentional, maintained. And then they noticed the camera. Mounted just above the hallway light, discreet but functional, a home security system, still powered, still recording. One officer would later tell investigators, it was like walking into a moment that had been paused on purpose. By early morning, crime scene techs were inside. Photographs, fingerprint dust, luminol sprays, the works. The first sweep showed no signs of additional blood trails or high-velocity splatter outside the bedroom. The body was left untouched until the medical examiner arrived shortly after 2 a.m. The victim was still clothed, jeans, t-shirt, socks. There was no wallet in the pockets, no cell phone near the bed. His arms were resting at his sides, no defensive wounds, no signs of a fall. There was no sign of a fight. If this was homicide, and detectives were leaning in that direction, it had happened fast, clean, cold. There were 2 children in the house, but no one called 911. Not his wife, not the neighbors, not even anonymous. The last time anyone saw or heard from Southan was early that afternoon, which meant he had likely been dead for hours. Southan In, as it turned out, was no ordinary civilian, a decorated Army veteran with service in Iraq. Honorable discharge, employed, well-liked by his peers, married, 2 kids under 5, no criminal record, no domestic calls ever placed from the house, no complaints from neighbors. His wife, Thierry Lim, was born in Cambodia. They'd met while he was abroad. Thierry had lived in the U.S. for several years and obtained permanent residency. No known prior arrests, no documented history of mental illness, no social media presence. Police detained her that night for questioning, standard procedure, but she was not arrested. When asked what happened, she gave a short answer. I was lying next to him. The gun went off. I didn't mean to. I just froze. She claimed she later took sleeping pills, that she passed out next to her children, that she never meant for any of this to happen. But something didn't sit right with investigators. As dawn broke on January 4th, the forensic team returned with a warrant to extract data from the home's security system. What they found would become central to the entire investigation. The footage covered the hours before and after Southan's death, every room, every movement, every choice. What the footage didn't show was any sign of surprise, no recoil, no panic, no reaction. Detectives started to ask a question that would echo throughout the case. If a person dies in a quiet house and no one reacts, Is it still an accident? The first 48 hours in any homicide are crucial. In this case, they were nearly silent. Following the initial discovery of 38-year-old Army veteran Southen deceased in his Clarksville, Tennessee home, investigators began mapping the timeline, hour by hour. The physical scene gave them a window. The digital data was supposed to tell them what happened before that window closed. By sunrise on January 4, 2022, detectives had already collected the household surveillance footage. The system had been active for over 12 hours prior to the moment Southen was found. But raw video wasn't enough. They needed the metadata, text logs, call patterns, GPS activity, to see if the quiet on the outside matched what was happening beneath the surface. They subpoenaed phone records from both Thierry Lim and her husband. What they received didn't raise alarm immediately, but something didn't sit right. The data didn't look natural. Southen's phone log showed a short list of routine contacts: workplace supervisor, family members, a few fellow veterans. His last known outgoing call was at 9:16 a.m. on the day of his death to a coworker, confirming a schedule for the week. After that, total silence, no texts, no GPS movement. The phone remained stationary inside the home, specifically in the master bedroom. Battery log confirmed the device was powered on but untouched for the next 12 hours. It was later recovered by police, face down on the carpet under the bed, unlocked, no open apps. Thierry's phone was different. Her data activity remained high throughout the day. Search queries on minor health symptoms, a visit to an online parenting forum, a web search on how long trazodone takes to act at 10:28 a.m., most of it benign. But at 12:12 p.m., something changed. A 22-minute international voice call to a number registered in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, not in her recent contact list. Not registered to any relative, no outgoing text afterward. The content of that call was unknown, but its placement, just 27 minutes before the presumed time of death, could not be ignored. Detectives flagged it immediately. They couldn't determine what was said, but the call's existence created the first digital anomaly in an otherwise routine morning. They expanded the data pool. GPS coordinates were examined through cell tower triangulation. The house had a fixed location ping for Thierry's phone all morning. There were no entries or exits recorded by her device. She hadn't left the premises, no rideshare orders, no bank withdrawals, no third-party app logins, but a separate detail emerged. The home's security system had been manually armed at 12:16 p.m. Internal logs showed the system shifted from standby to privacy mode, a setting that disabled motion-triggered alerts and restricted off-site access to live camera views. This wasn't automatic. It required action from the control panel or via mobile device. Thierry later stated she had no memory of changing the system settings. Investigators took note. The shooting occurred approximately 23 minutes later. Back at the station, an analyst cross-referenced timestamps from the surveillance feed with digital logs from the smart home interface. The sync was exact. This mattered because too often, in digital forensics, delay or drift can weaken a timeline. But here, everything lined up too neatly. One investigator summarized the unease. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. There were no buffering gaps in video, no time gaps in message logs, no glitches in GPS, and yet no one heard the gunshot. No neighbor reported a loud noise. No child cried loud enough to draw attention. Nothing tripped the motion detectors inside the hallway, despite recorded movement after 1 p.m. That shouldn't have happened, unless motion sensors had also been manually disabled, which they had. At this point, police hadn't charged anyone. Thierry Lim was released later that day, pending further investigation. She was not considered a flight risk, and there was no physical evidence tying her directly to the fatal wound. She returned to stay with extended relatives in Clarksville. The two children were placed in temporary care. Detectives began preparing a full behavioral and forensic reconstruction of the hours between 9 a.m. and 10 p.m. to determine not just what happened, but why no one responded. The lead investigator made a note in the case file that stood out. The silence wasn't just after the act, it was before it. This may have been planned, technically, if not emotionally. This chapter raised more questions than answers. Was the international call a coincidence or a precursor to a planned act? Why was the security system altered shortly before the shot? Was it done to prevent detection, or just to create false context. The data suggested control, not randomness, and that control had a digital signature. Theory's phone never left the house, but neither did Sothan's body. The autopsy was scheduled for the morning of January 5, 2022, just over 36 hours after the body of Sothan In was discovered. The case had already moved past routine. There was no natural cause. There was no medical event. The trajectory of the wound alone made that clear. The body arrived at the Montgomery County Medical Examiner's office just before 8 o'clock a.m., transported under sealed chain of custody. The victim had not been moved since the initial photographs were taken in the master bedroom. Flat on his back, arms to his side, facial features undisturbed. His eyes were closed, possibly by the first responder, possibly naturally. There were no indications of post-mortem manipulation. The medical examiner, Dr. Vanessa Rollins, began her documentation the same way she had in every one of her 1,400-plus cases: body temp, livor mortis, rigor, external condition, then entry wound. It was centered just above the left eyebrow. A precise puncture, clean, consistent with a single round from a 9mm handgun at intermediate to close range. There was no stippling, no powder tattooing, but a faint soot deposit was visible on the skin, indicating proximity. The bullet path was fatal. It traveled backward and slightly downward, exiting through the lower rear parietal bone. The round had passed through soft tissue and brain matter, leaving extensive damage. Death would have been instantaneous or nearly so. There was no defensive injury on the arms, no broken fingernails, no bruising along the forearms or hands. Toxicology revealed no alcohol, no controlled substances. The only compound in his system was a therapeutic dose of anti-hypertensive medication, consistent with prescriptions later confirmed through pharmacy records. His stomach contents indicated a small, undigested meal, eggs and white rice. Time of last ingestion estimated around 11:30 a.m. Dr. Rollins made a notation. Estimated time of death between 12:30 p.m. and 1 o'clock p.m. based on gastric processing, body cooling, and livor position. Her conclusion would later match perfectly with the surveillance timeline obtained from the home, specifically the audio spike registered at 12:39 p.m. That alignment mattered. But for detectives, what stood out wasn't just what the autopsy confirmed. It was what it ruled out. The trajectory of the bullet suggested a shot delivered at standing or slightly reclined height from someone positioned directly in front of the victim. The angle was clean, too clean for an accidental discharge. The wound was not angled from below or from an unusual posture. It was direct. This contradicted the initial verbal explanation offered by Theory Lim. She had said the weapon just went off while they were lying on the bed. That story now presented a problem. If both individuals had been lying side by side, the angle of the bullet would likely have been upward or tangential, not straight into the forehead. If she had been on his right side, the shot would have required a left-handed grip. She was right-handed. Dr. Rollins included this analysis in her findings, not as a legal opinion, but as a physical reality. The positioning didn't support accidental discharge. It supported deliberate aim. Investigators also requested residue testing on the victim's hands. Gunshot residue was negative. There were no trace particles of barium, lead, or antimony typically found after firearm discharge. His fingertips were clean. The conclusion was straightforward. Sothan In did not fire the weapon. A second GSR test was ordered for Theory Lim's clothing. Due to the delay between the incident and the scene being secured, results were inconclusive. The trace samples had been potentially contaminated by proximity to the children, fabric absorption, and time lapse. However, swabs collected from the right shoulder area showed elevated particle counts, enough to warrant further testing by the TBI lab. A separate note from Dr. Rollins identified an absence of hemorrhagic response around the wound margins, meaning the gunshot occurred while blood pressure was falling or flatlining. No evidence of physical struggle was documented anywhere on the torso or limbs. The body told a clear story. As the report was finalized, Dr. Rollins included a short observation under summary narrative. It was standard practice, but in some cases it captured the tone in a way the rest of the document couldn't. Victim presented without signs of trauma beyond single-entry ballistic injury. Scene photos and wound mechanics support conclusion of stationary victim at time of shot. Trajectory consistent with intentional targeting from a standing or slightly elevated position. No supportive evidence of reflexive movement or external interference post-mortem. It didn't say homicide. That wasn't her role, but it didn't need to. Back at the Clarksville PD, detectives now had alignment across 3 separate data sets. Digital activity from Theory Lim's phone and the security system surveillance footage timestamped to 12:39 p.m. Autopsy results confirming time of death and trajectory. None of the findings pointed to uncertainty. All of them narrowed the window. A cold question was forming. If this wasn't spontaneous, then how much of it was structured? From a storytelling standpoint, true crime cases often hinge on confession, motive, or contradiction. But in this case, it wasn't about what was said. It was about what couldn't be disproven. The body, the weapon, the timeline, they weren't offering theories. They were confirming events. And that's what made this case different. It wasn't built around speculation. It was being built, frame by frame, from the silence that followed the act. The challenge in reconstructing a murder isn't always about finding the missing moments. Sometimes it's about interpreting the ones that are plainly visible, especially when they're being watched. By the end of the first week in January 2022, detectives had the full surveillance footage from inside the home on Ladd Drive. No editing, no gaps. What they reviewed covered a 12-hour span, before and after the estimated time of death. But the footage didn't bring resolution. It brought new questions. The recording showed a household moving in slow, methodical rhythms. Around 9:45 a.m., the front door camera caught Sawthon. In returning home, he walked in holding a takeout bag. Based on the autopsy findings, specifically egg and rice in his stomach, the timeline aligned. By 11:30 a.m., the children could be seen moving between the kitchen and living room. Theory Lim remained mostly out of frame. She appeared only occasionally, always calm, walking between rooms without visible signs of agitation. Then came 12:16 p.m. The internal home security panel registered an input, privacy mode enabled, motion alerts silenced, the front camera deactivated. Interior cameras remained active, but now only recorded locally. At 12:39 p.m., the hallway mic caught a sharp acoustic spike. No flash was visible, but the waveform in the audio track confirmed what the forensic team had already concluded. A gun had been fired. What followed was silence. For nearly 9 hours after that moment, the home was still. No one ran from the room. No one called 911. No one even left the property. Instead, the cameras showed Theory Lim entering the bedroom at 1:11 p.m. She stood near the bed for exactly 40 seconds motionless. Then she turned and walked out. The 2 toddlers followed her. Over the course of the afternoon, she reappeared on camera 5 more times. In each frame, she was holding either a dish towel, a pair of gloves, or in one case, a kitchen knife. None of these objects were used in a threatening way, but none of them were explained either. Investigators flagged 2 key timestamps. At 2:52 p.m., she stood at the hallway entry point and stared into the camera lens for 18 full seconds. At 5:36 p.m., she was seen sitting on the floor near the children, both of whom were lying on the carpet, covered by a single blanket. There were no outbursts, no shouting, just long stretches of waiting. The longer they watched, the more they questioned whether the silence was shock or part of the plan. Eventually, forensic analysts overlaid the footage timeline with a record of activity on Theory's phone. Between 1:00 p.m. and 9:30 p.m., the phone was used only once, a Google search for trazodone side effects. She did not send any texts. She did not make or answer any calls. At 3:17 p.m., she opened a note app. The screen remained lit for 13 minutes. Nothing was typed. Behavioral profilers later reviewed the footage alongside this data. One summarized the pattern as contained pacing, movement without disorder, purpose without expression. It did not align with typical profiles of someone in grief or trauma shock. This wasn't someone who had just lost control. This was someone maintaining it. Officers returned to the scene on January 6 to verify the digital timestamps. They physically measured the angles of camera coverage, cross-checked hallway motion sensors, and confirmed lighting consistency to avoid misinterpreting behavior. Their findings supported the original footage. Everything captured matched the timeline to within a 90-second margin of error. Of note, no attempt had been made to delete, reset, or disable the cameras post-incident. The fact that the recordings remained intact made one investigator note, this wasn't about hiding what happened. It was about enduring it. That observation triggered a critical question. Had this been rehearsed emotionally, even if not technically? And if so, was the absence of panic the most disturbing evidence of all? Detectives continued building the profile, not by looking for more dramatic clues, but by studying what remained uninterrupted: the children. Throughout the day, both toddlers appeared alert, quiet, but calm. And they followed Theory from room to room. They did not appear afraid. No raised voices were heard. No signs of distress recorded. This raised concerns among child welfare advocates, not just about the event itself, but about the emotional normalization inside that house. When patterns become routine, even violence can look like background noise. In one final clip from 9:23 p.m., minutes before police arrived, Theory is seen walking down the hallway alone. She pauses, looks into the camera, then turns off the light. That was the last movement captured before the friend knocked on the door. What made this chapter in the investigation different wasn't a new discovery. It was that nothing was missing. No erased footage. No data gaps. It was all there, and that was what made it difficult to look away. Theory never ran. She never called for help, and she never explained why. In homicide investigations, the hardest version of the truth to prove isn't the forensic one. It's the behavioral. The facts may line up, but without understanding motive, or at least context, even the clearest evidence leaves room for doubt. That's why the next phase of the investigation focused not on what happened, but why it happened. Following the forensic confirmation of the shooting and the preserved surveillance footage, Clarksville detectives turned their attention to family interviews. Specifically, they wanted to understand who Theory Lim was before January 5, 2025, and how her relationship with Sothan In, the 36-year-old Army veteran found dead in their home, had evolved. Theory and Sothan were described by neighbors as quiet, reserved, and kept to themselves. But the silence outside their home did not match the internal dynamics reported by those who knew them personally. Interviews with Sothan's family, especially his older sister and mother, revealed repeated concerns over his emotional well-being. According to them, Sothan had become increasingly withdrawn in late 2024, with his phone calls becoming shorter and more infrequent. When they did manage to speak, he reportedly mentioned being tired of arguing. One relative claimed Sothan had voiced interest in reapplying for part-time work to re-establish financial independence. This aligned with bank records showing small but consistent deposits from late October through December 2024, totaling just under $1,100. While modest, these deposits suggested an effort to build autonomy, a detail that became relevant once it was discovered that Theory had sole control of the couple's joint account. The financial asymmetry raised eyebrows. Investigators subpoenaed financial data, which revealed that Theory had recently transferred $3,500 from the joint account to a separate personal account 2 days prior to the homicide. There was no accompanying text message or note, but the timing triggered further scrutiny. Meanwhile, friends of Theory painted a different picture. Two colleagues from her previous part-time work at a dental clinic described her as composed under stress and not the type to react emotionally. One of them mentioned that in early December, Theory had taken unpaid leave citing family safety reasons. She did not elaborate. When asked directly whether Theory had ever spoken of feeling threatened by her husband, both responded no. But one added, "She did say once, he's not the same anymore." Notably, a CPS, Child Protective Services report filed in September 2023, months before the incident, had recorded a non-urgent welfare concern after one of the children arrived at daycare with bruises. The report was closed without escalation. At the time, neither parent was found to be unfit, and both denied any physical altercations at home. This background created a conflict in character. There were no domestic violence reports, no history of restraining orders, no mental health interventions. Yet everyone close to the couple described some form of tension, just never loud enough for authorities to hear. As for motive, prosecutors would later rely not on physical evidence, but behavioral trajectory. They pointed to a shift in power balance, financial separation, emotional detachment, and finally, surveillance silence. It wasn't sudden. It was incremental. One expert witness during pre-trial described it as a boiling point disguised as a routine. Still, motive alone wasn't sufficient. What came next were statements from Theory herself, first in informal interviews, later under Miranda rights. Her demeanor remained consistent throughout, neutral, minimally expressive, and, at times, frustratingly non-committal. When asked why she didn't call for help after the gunshot, she reportedly answered, "He wouldn't have wanted that." When asked what happened inside the room at 12:39 p.m., she responded, "I did what I thought I had to." The statements were recorded but not publicly released in full. However, court affidavits confirmed that Theory never denied pulling the trigger. What she refused to do, then and later in trial, was explain what she feared, if anything, or what preceded the act. Throughout these developments, one detail continued to puzzle investigators. Why was there no visible struggle? Sothon In was found lying on his side, facing away from the door. The trajectory of the bullet, entering the back of his head at a downward angle, strongly suggested that he was seated or lying down at the time of the shooting. There were no signs of defensive wounds. No overturned furniture, no fingerprints on the weapon besides Theory's. It didn't look like a fight. It looked like a decision. By early February, the district attorney's office filed formal charges. First-degree murder with aggravating circumstances based on the presence of minors and premeditation inferred from financial and behavioral data. The defense filed a motion to reduce charges to second degree, arguing diminished capacity and possible psychological distress. But no mental health records were introduced, and no psychological evaluation had been conducted prior to the motion. The court denied the request. What remains difficult in this case, even after formal indictment and eventual sentencing, is the emotional ambiguity. Both sides of the family carry versions of grief shaped not by what was said, but by what was withheld. In the absence of a clear narrative, the question persists. Was this a response to years of silent abuse, or an execution shaped by control? The courthouse in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, sat just 2 miles from the home where the shooting occurred. By the first week of April 2025, the pre-trial proceedings for state fee Theory Lim had begun, quieter than most high-profile homicide cases, but tense in every detail. This wasn't a media circus. It was a carefully calculated chess match, one that began with the slow and deliberate layout of forensic evidence. What emerged during pre-trial was not new discovery, but how existing material was curated for court. The surveillance footage, ballistic reports, digital timestamps, and financial traces already secured during investigation were now packaged to construct intent. Prosecutors did not rely on one dramatic breakthrough. They built a wall of small certainties. Surveillance remained the crown piece. The single static security camera, affixed above the garage and activated by motion, had captured a 46-second window that would anchor the state's timeline. It showed the victim, Theory Lim's estranged husband, an Army veteran in his mid-50s, pulling into the driveway at 11:16 a.m. on January 5, 2025. He exited the vehicle holding a small padded envelope. By 11:18 a.m., the camera detected motion again. This time, Lim walking back toward the vehicle alone. No outward distress, no pacing, just a firm gait and gloves on her hands. Prosecutors interpreted that stillness as premeditation. For the defense, the challenge was not the footage, it was its silence. There was no audio, no image inside the home, no weapon clearly visible. But prosecutors had more. They had trajectory modeling. The fatal shot, according to ballistics, had entered the left anterior thorax downward angle from approximately 6 feet away. Blood spatter analysis revealed medium velocity impact on the left wall adjacent to the hallway, a match to the crime scene photos logged by the initial responding unit. The medical examiner's testimony prepared in advance confirmed what investigators already knew but needed clarified under oath. The victim died from a single gunshot wound to the chest, fired from a distance, not during a physical struggle. There were no signs of defensive wounds. Toxicology found only therapeutic levels of prescribed medication. No alcohol, no illicit substances. The man had been ambushed, not provoked. In building narrative control, the prosecution leaned into motive. They presented financial records indicating that Lim had withdrawn $4,200 in cash 2 days before the shooting. They subpoenaed her browser history, which included searches for self-defense gun laws Tennessee and stand your ground versus castle doctrine. While the defense claimed this reflected anxiety due to a tense marital history, the timeline suggested planning, not panic. The public didn't get full access to these details right away, but local media did catch wind of the case. The Tennessean ran a short column, "Wife accused in fatal shooting of Army veteran husband, possible domestic history." Social media posts speculated on motive, but there was no viral traction, perhaps because both parties had lived quietly, without a known history of public violence. Still, the lack of spectacle didn't dilute the gravity. Community forums began to stir questions. Why would a woman with no prior record suddenly pull the trigger? Was there history behind closed doors that the court couldn't or wouldn't admit? Inside the DA's office, the strategy was straightforward. Let the physical evidence speak. No reliance on character attacks, no speculative emotional arcs. The district attorney, a 14-year veteran of homicide prosecution, was heard telling staff, "This is not a who did it, this is a why did she do it, and the why is in the quiet." Meanwhile, Lim's defense team tried to anchor the case in ambiguity. They filed motions to suppress parts of the surveillance footage, citing incomplete angles and lack of audio. Denied. They attempted to introduce documents suggesting past marital instability, but without police records, restraining orders, or corroboration, it bordered on hearsay. The judge maintained evidentiary standards strictly. The focus remained on traceable facts, not emotional reconstruction. Among the more subtle but critical components was the glove evidence. Investigators had recovered a pair of latex gloves discarded in a small trash bin near the back patio. DNA analysis confirmed they belonged to Lim. Gunshot residue was present on both gloves. That detail, the gloves being worn, not merely owned, tightened the timeline and narrowed opportunity. It left little room for spontaneous fear or accident. From a procedural standpoint, this chapter of the case exemplified what true crime often misses in dramatization. The moments before a trial begins are less about flair, more about structure. Prosecutors weren't trying to surprise the jury, they were building inevitability. Every bullet point became part of a sequence that answered not just how, but when and with what intention. As April continued, public defenders across the state quietly monitored the case. Not because of celebrity, but because of precedent. It raised renewed scrutiny over how domestic disputes are interpreted when the tables turn, when the accused is a woman, the victim a veteran, and the timeline surgically documented. The trial officially commenced on April 15, 2025, inside Courtroom 3B of the Rutherford County Judicial Building. The state of Tennessee versus Theory Lim was called to order at 9:02 a.m., with Judge Harris presiding. Jury selection had concluded 2 days earlier. 12 jurors, 8 women, 4 men, sat in silence as opening statements began. The temperature outside hovered at 64 degrees. Inside, the courtroom felt colder than the concrete floors beneath the defense table. The prosecution's first move wasn't dramatic, it was calculated. They opened with an enlarged frame from the home surveillance footage. The Army veteran walking toward the front door with a brown envelope, time-stamped January 5th, 2025 at 11:16 a.m. It wasn't just a visual, it was a time anchor. They followed with the 911 call. The voice of Theory Lim, measured, steady, too controlled. Prosecutors did not comment on her tone. They let the recording play in full. Next came the forensics. Special Agent Mitchell from the TBI's crime scene unit took the stand. He had processed over 300 major scenes across Tennessee, but in this case, he focused on ballistic directionality and blood spatter distribution. Using 3D reconstructions and physical measurements from the hallway, he detailed how the bullet trajectory confirmed the shooter had positioned themselves at least 6 feet away. The entry angle was consistent with a shot fired while the victim stood upright, mid-conversation or entry, not charging or attacking. Jurors watched intently as he presented the glove evidence. A pair of latex gloves recovered from a plastic bin on the rear patio. Gunshot residue and DNA from Lim confirmed usage. Swabs from her right index and thumb also returned positive for GSR, despite her claims that she had not handled the weapon directly. A forensic timeline reconstructed by the lab placed the probable time of death between 11:16 and 11:19 a.m., within 3 minutes of the victim's arrival. Throughout the day, the defense challenged procedure, not conclusions. They questioned the chain of custody. They scrutinized the lack of audio, but the evidence held. Then came the second layer, motive through behavior. The prosecution introduced financial records showing Lim had withdrawn $4,200 in cash 2 days before the incident. On cross-examination, the defense argued it was for emergency relocation funds. But under redirect, prosecutors revealed a browser history from her laptop, searches for quick cash sales, Tennessee Castle Doctrine, and how long does it take for GSR to wash off. On April 17th, a digital forensic analyst from the Department of Safety testified that Lim's phone had been placed in airplane mode for 36 minutes between 11:15 and 11:51 a.m. on the day of the incident. No incoming or outgoing communications were logged during the key window when the homicide occurred. The implication, intentional suppression of data. By day 3 of testimony, the jury had heard from 5 witnesses, each building on the last. None offered speculation. No one claimed to know Lim's emotional state. This trial was not built on character, but chain of evidence. In contrast, the defense relied on ambiguity. They leaned into the lack of witnesses, the silence of the home. They argued there were no prior domestic abuse reports because their conflict had been internalized, not documented. But the court didn't deal in what wasn't filed. It dealt in what could be proven. The court clerk noted minimal objections. The process was running with precision, no theatrics, no sudden confessions, just fact layered over fact. Still, inside that quiet structure, a question kept emerging. Why a woman with no prior criminal record, no history of violence, and a stable job would execute such a clean, deliberate act? Was this a case of hidden domestic escalation, or was it premeditated from the start? The answer wasn't yet clear, but by the end of that third day, one thing was, jurors were no longer asking if she had done it. They were now asking why she had done it, and whether it legally mattered. As courtroom observers filtered out on April 17th, several paused by the posted docket. One woman remarked that she had expected something more messy. But this wasn't a messy case. It was tidy, disturbingly tidy. The trial would resume Monday morning, April 21st, with testimony from the lead homicide detective, a clinical psychologist, and the final cross-examination of Lim herself. The defense had asked to delay her testimony until the state rested. The request was granted. At this stage, what mattered most was whether the jury would interpret silence as strategy or as guilt. On April 15, 2025, inside a Tennessee courtroom, Theory Lim stood silent as the jury's decision was read aloud. She didn't flinch when the words "guilty of first-degree murder" echoed across the room. Nor did she look back at the gallery. Her eyes remained fixed on the floor as the judge followed up with a life sentence, without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was still. No cries, no outrage, only the weight of what had been done. This wasn't a case marked by media spectacle or loud protests. It was the quiet, devastating end of a violent rupture that had been building for years between two people who once shared a home and a marriage. The jury deliberated for under 5 hours. By then, the evidence had already drawn its own map, ballistic reports matching the bullet to a firearm registered under Lim's name. The trajectory confirmed a close-range shot with no sign of a struggle suggesting self-defense. Gunpowder residue was consistent with her firing the weapon. And her digital history, unusual late-night searches about Tennessee gun laws and post-homicide legal consequences, added further weight to the case. Notably, her own recorded statement, given without legal counsel, had left several inconsistencies investigators capitalized on. By trial's end, prosecutors had made it clear this wasn't a heat-of-the-moment act. It was a calculated decision carried out with lethal certainty. But here's what lingers after the courtroom clears. There was no moment of reflection from Lim, no statement of remorse, no explanation, just silence. One of the detectives later remarked, "She never once asked about the victim, never asked what happened to him. That silence was louder than any confession." Outside the courthouse, a local veterans support group issued a brief statement mourning the loss of one of their own. The victim, a former Army serviceman, had reportedly served honorably and tried to rebuild his civilian life in quiet, staying mostly off social media and out of the public eye. Neighbors remembered occasional loud arguments between the two, but no police reports had ever been filed. The warning signs were there, but never followed. Theory Lim's case joins a troubling pattern seen in recent years. Domestic violence cases that escalate in silence, where neither party seeks help, and the violence erupts too late to intervene. While most conversations around veteran support focus on PTSD and reintegration, this case exposed another dimension. What happens when emotional volatility, unresolved conflict, and isolation converge without support or accountability? The court's ruling is final. Lim will spend the rest of her life in a Tennessee state facility. She will not be eligible for release, nor for sentence reduction. For the family of the victim, whose name remains shielded from public release out of respect, this offers legal closure, but no personal healing. Their grief is private, their burden ongoing. From a narrative standpoint, the facts may appear simple: a marriage broken beyond repair, a gun fired, a life taken, a sentence handed down. But beneath that sequence lies a deeper truth. Every ignored warning, every unspoken fear, every missed opportunity to intervene becomes a thread in a tragic tapestry that can never be unwoven. And in telling this story, we're reminded of one thing. Violence rarely begins with the final act. It builds quietly, behind doors we don't open, in conversations we avoid. What justice offers is an ending, but what prevention needs is attention, far earlier. In the end, I'm just someone who believes that silence, when it comes to violence, can cost lives. If there's one thing this story reminds me, it's that unchecked conflict doesn't stay quiet forever. If you're living in fear or know someone who is, speak up. Don't wait for tragedy to be the thing that forces change. What are your thoughts? Do you think there were signs people missed or systems that failed them both? If this video moved you or made you think, drop a comment below. Let me know where you're watching from. If it didn't resonate, I still want to hear why. And if stories like this matter to you, hit subscribe. I've got more real stories, raw, honest, and unforgettable, coming soon.